introduction. So thank you very much for being here with us. As I was telling for those who are also listening, this is our last smart discussion between holidays. It's our 75 smart discussion. That's a great opportunity to share with Professor Timothy Gartenach, that is a well-known and very, very, very respected professor and researcher and writer on topics like Europe and things that are connected with that. He published very recently a very, very good book. I suggest everybody to buy the book and to read it. I have already bought, and it's very, very interesting. He speaks a little bit about the history of Europe. I think you are going to present the book, right, in Lisbon, in the studio? Yes.
Indeed, tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay. And as you know, he's going to give some interviews to Express, to public, and things like that. Professor, thank you very much for being with us. It's an honor to have you with us, and I hope you can have a very interesting meeting, okay, on 7. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Filipe, pode tirar a imagem também, faz favor. Thank you.
You hear me okay? As you mentioned, I'm really here for the Portuguese edition of my book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, which in the Portuguese edition is Pátrias. For me, it seems to me one of the most distinctive things about being a European is that one can be at home abroad. I'm in Estoril, or I'm in Berlin, or I'm in Prague, or I'm in Warsaw. I'm clearly abroad, but I'm also at home, hence the title, Homelands in the plural. And it's a history of a personal history of Europe since 1945. I distinguish between two periods, the post-war period after 1945 and what I call the post-wall period from the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 until the 24th of February 2022, Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I argue that that is now a closed period.
Yes.
Painting with a very broad brush, I would say that the pattern of European history that I discern is starting from when I started traveling in continental Europe regularly 50 years ago, when most of Europe was still living under dictators. 389 million Europeans were living under dictatorships, only 289 million under democracies. And the dictatorships, of course, including Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And then broadly speaking, you have a steady, discontinuous, but ascent through the end of the dictatorships in Southern Europe, the end of the communist dictatorships in East Central Europe, the Baltic states, Southeastern Europe, Ukraine, and a spectacular eastward enlargement of the geopolitical West. 6 member states of the EEC in 1972, 15 of NATO, 2007, 27 member states of the EU, 26 of NATO. So obviously discontinuous. You have the wars in former Yugoslavia, you have 9/11, you have other setbacks, but nonetheless a great upward movement. And then from 2008 onward, we have what I call the downward turn, starting with the simultaneous events of the global financial crisis and Vladimir Putin's seizure of 2 chunks of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And from then on, you have a cascade of crises, the global financial crisis segueing into the Eurozone crisis, Ukraine 2014, Viktor Orban begins to dismantle democracy in Hungary already in 2010, the refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump, COVID, all the way down to the largest war in Europe since 1945. The stages are familiar to you. We could talk in the discussion period about why we came to this great downward turn after such a period of success. One of the basic reasons, I think, is what I call a historiosophical mistake. Put it at its simplest, it's a fallacy of extrapolation. after things had gone so relatively well for 35 years, we convinced ourselves that things would go on going that way. We took the most non-linear event in European history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, altogether what happened in 1989, which was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, and turned it into a linear projection. Or to put it more broadly, we took history with a small h, which is always the interaction of deep structure and process on the one hand, and chance, contingency, conjuncture, collective will, and individual leadership on the other, and turned it into history with a capital H, Hegelian, inevitable, a process of progress towards greater freedom. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that we failed to learn a very simple lesson of history, which is about declining empires. Let me let you into a secret. Declining empires don't like declining. They tend to strike back. Ask the British, ask the French, ask the Portuguese. After all, if one looks at the long struggle to defend the colonies in Angola and Mozambique into the early 1970s. So when the largest remaining European empire, namely the Soviet-Russian Empire, softly and suddenly vanished away in just 3 years in 1991, we should not have assumed that was the end of the story. I tell in the book the story of my meeting with Vladimir Putin when he was a totally unknown deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. 1994, big conference, no one had heard of this guy. At the end of 2 days at this conference, which is all about improving relations between the West and Russia, V. Putin asked for the floor and says, we have to remember that there are territories that have historically always been Russian, and they're now outside Russia, and we have a duty towards them. And he explicitly mentions Crimea. And he says there are 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty to protect them. Don't tell me NATO enlargement was the cause of his invasion of Ukraine. This is 5 years before the first eastward enlargement of NATO. Of course, you can't draw a straight line from Putin 1994 to 2014, when he actually seizes Crimea and starts a war in eastern Ukraine, which is going on to this day. But nonetheless, when it started happening, Georgia 2008, above all, Crimea 2014, we should have recognized what was happening. This is an empire striking back. And if we had adjusted our policy much more radically, we might not be in the mess we're in today. But we are in that mess, and let me say a few words, just pick up literally 3 or 4 points very selectively on the subject of the future of Europe, which is, of course, unknown because it depends on us. But nonetheless, point number 1, there is no alternative now to helping Ukraine to win this war. That is the only path to a lasting peace. This is not a moment where lasting peace can be achieved by negotiation. Neither side is ready for it. What has happened, the amazing events of the last 2 days, are extremely encouraging for that particular prospect. I've been in Ukraine twice in the last 6 months, talked to the head of the armed forces, the head of military intelligence, Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's right-hand man, and a lot of other people. The Ukrainian theory of victory is a political theory. They don't believe that, as someone put it to me, a small red army can defeat a big red army, right? That you can simply grind away square kilometer by square kilometer to regain control of your entire territory. What they believe, their gamble, if you like, is that if you inflict sufficient damage, sufficient defeat, sufficient hammer blows on the occupying forces, you will catalyze some kind of a political change in Russia. Okay? So 1905, defeating the Russo-Japanese War, revolution. 1917, to which Mr. Putin very revealingly referred in his speech. Again, it doesn't have to be a revolution. It has to be some set of events, unforeseeable, in which either Putin himself decides that he can't win and therefore he has to cut his losses and get out, or he is, if not deposed, sufficiently constrained. Nobody knows how that will happen. And, you know, so many realists have said to me, but this is totally unrealistic, quite unrealistic to imagine that, for example, Mr. Putin's own protege should conduct an armed mutiny, seize the military headquarters in a major Russian city, Rostov-on-Don, get halfway to Moscow, and get away with it. And that Putin will have to ask President Lukashenko of Belarus to mediate between them. This very clearly, significantly weakens the Putin regime because it is a clear signal of weakness to everyone who's been watching these events. His own creature challenged him frontally and is still alive and has got away with it. So, even though we don't know how this is going to play out, and we can talk about it in the discussion period, it's good news for Ukraine and the prospect of Ukrainian victory. Secondly, more strategically, I talked about the great double eastward enlargement of the geopolitical West between 1990 and 2007, that great sweep forward. Basically, we then stalled for 15 years. Croatia came into the EU, a few small countries came into NATO, but basically it stalled. And in line with the wisdom of Heraclitus, war is the father of all things, that logjam has now been unstuck, and we have a commitment to a new strategic eastward enlargement of the geopolitical West, specifically of the EU, not just the Western Balkans, but Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. But I would argue it's, and increasingly I think people are beginning to understand it has to be NATO as well. If you look at what Sweden and Finland have done in response to the war in Ukraine, i.e. joining NATO, you see that NATO and EU are ever more becoming the two strong arms of the West. So that for me is a really crucial part of the new strategic agenda for the EU. And of course, that widening necessarily entails further deepening of the EU. And the crucial question to us is how can this be done? Because it clearly has to be done differently from in the past. I have some thoughts on that very briefly. It has to be done incrementally. Progressive integration is the term that comes to mind, actually both for NATO and for EU. And we could perhaps talk in the discussion period about how that is done. But that is, for me, one of the big new strategic agendas for Europe over the next 10 to 15 years. If we succeed, as I argue in a recent article in Foreign Affairs, we will have for the first time a post-imperial Europe. That is to say, a Europe that has no classic empires with a national hegemon, either on land or overseas. Final point before opening this up. The external environment, the global environment. Looking back, I mean, we can see that the global environment in 1989-90 was uniquely favorable to what we were trying to do. Now we're in a very different environment. What the Ukraine war has revealed is that we have a number of non-Western great and middle powers, not just China, but also India, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, who simply do not see it as their duty or in their interest to line up with the West, even faced with a major war of aggression and recolonization. My Oxford research project did some polling with ECFR. 80% of Indians say that Russia remains either an ally or a necessary partner, roughly the same figure as for Britain, and only slightly less as for the EU and the US, something similar in Turkey. And of course, we have other global challenges like climate change, like the North-South divide, migration, technology, AI. So at the same time as the immediate agenda of helping Ukraine to win the war, at the same time as the larger strategic agenda of improving the functioning of the existing EU, but also preparing for enlargement, we face this much wider set of global challenges, which of course is one reason why we need a stronger European Union and why Brexit, which I'd be happy to talk about for a moment, is such a disaster, not just for Britain, but also a very negative development for the EU. Let me finish on that with just saying that the famous classical formula, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, is exactly what we need at this moment. One of the things that I think my book tries to argue is that pessimism of the intellect can actually be very constructive. So if you look at where we were in the 1970s, people forget we still had dictatorships. The US after Vietnam and Watergate was down and out. Britain was the sick man of Europe. There was normalization in Eastern Europe. I mean, things, we had the oil price shock, right? The end of the Trente Glorieuses. Things looked very bad for the West and for Europe. But because we had the necessary combination of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, we faced up to how serious the problems were and found solutions which actually launched us into this great upward turn from the 1980s through the 1990s. What happens in the early to mid 2000s is the precise opposite, because we have this ill-founded optimism of the intellect, because we believe that everything is just going well and we just have to carry on the way we were carrying on. We plunge directly as a result into the downward turn starting in 2008. So that's what we need: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And with that, let me take it back to you, and I look forward very much to the conversation.
Yes. Professor Timothy, thank you very much. As it was expected, it was excellent reflection on what's going on, and very, very updating what's going on in Russia and things like that. So we are going to have the discussion as we combined before. So I will ask, okay, we have here already Luis Barreto Xavier, but Luis, if you don't mind, I will ask Paulo Sand, because he is our expert on European studies, to start with a little comment or question. So Professor Timothy, I don't know if you know Paulo. Paulo is also involved in Catholic University in an historiopolitical conference. So I think Paulo, I would like to have a brief, not very, very large, okay, so that we have a good discussion. But please,
yes,
please,
okay.
please.
Okay, Jean, thank you very much, Professor. It's a pleasure to be with you. And but I have something I have to complain about you. Is I invited you some 20 years ago to come to Portugal, and you refused me. So I'm very glad that I can address you directly.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking. It was I was very sad, but you couldn't at the time. It was anyhow. Let me tell you first of all that it was very enlightening. Your books are very enlightening. I still didn't read the last one, which everybody tells me it's very, very interesting and very important for the way we look at.
It's a fantastic book, Paulo. I can assure you.
Yes, you already told me that. So no, but anyhow, thank you very much. This is very challenging. Also, it's to be the first one is very. I have to think about what you said. Some of the things you said are very challenging and interesting. But I would just start with two things. Two main aspects. First of all, it's because of Brexit, which I agree with you. It's a very bad thing for Europe and very bad thing for England or the United Kingdom, as you will. But the point of last week, I moderated a debate with Mr. Cameron the former PM and our mayor of Lisbon, Mr. Moedas. And I asked Mr. Cameron, what about Brexit, and if the referendum was done this year or today or whenever, if the outcome would be the same. And he said, of course, all polls and all opinion studies now tend to say that people think that Brexit was a bad thing. But if there was a new referendum, they would vote once again to leave. Well, this is what David Cameron said, but I was just asking. And my second question concerns resources, because it's a very good idea what you said from my point of view, the idea of incremental growth of the European Union. To a certain extent, we can't go on like what we are now. I mean, negotiating forever, you know, a never-ending story of negotiation with Balkans country, Turkey, and so on, and now, of course, with Ukraine. But my question is, how can that be done without the increase of resources, the European Union's resources? Because they are scarce, they're not enough, they don't grow, as you know, and with more countries requiring assistance, because that's the basis of the European Union, is solidarity and cohesion. But we don't have more money, we won't have more resources. So what's the solution? Okay, I will leave it with this.
Professor, do you prefer to answer now or to have two more questions? It's up to you.
Entirely in your hands, whichever you would rather.
Okay, so I will ask Luis and Miguel Henriques to make a brief question, and then you can organize them. Luis, please.
Thank you, Jaime, and thank you, Professor. Just a quick question. I'd like to ask you to elaborate a bit on the consequences of the Ukraine invasion on the relationship between the West and China and India, because I fear that China and India are more distant now than they were before, and I wonder what the consequences will be for Europe, for the US, for globalization, and are we creating again a more polarized world? So that's the question.
Okay, Miguel Henriques, that is a person that is also involved in questions of energy and the economy. Miguel, we are not listening to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Professor Bartonas, thanks very much for such an insightful lecture. My question is about the role of the UK now. I thought you wouldn't mention Brexit, you did, but now what is the role that the UK will play? Thank you.
Okay, so Professor, we have already here some questions, so you can please ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So let me take Brexit and the role of the UK together, because they're obviously closely connected, and say that with great respect to David Cameron, I think he is completely wrong. The French philosopher Henri Bergson talks about the illusions of retrospective determinism, the almost irresistible temptation to think that what actually happened somehow had to happen. And this is what's happened when applied to Brexit. It was anything but inevitable, just as the fall of the Berlin Wall was anything but inevitable. The good news and the bad news, both of them. 650,000 votes. If we'd had a different leader of the Labour Party, if the Brits who lived abroad for more than 15 years in continental Europe had been given the vote, which was promised in the Conservative Party manifesto, David Cameron's party manifesto, if people between the age of 16 and 18 had been allowed to vote, any one of two or three of these basically conjunctural factors, and it could have gone the other way. And then everybody would be writing very wise chapters in the history books saying how inevitable it was that the pragmatic British nation of shopkeepers would, follow their economic self-interest and stay in the EU. But it was this particular moment where all those different circumstances came together just to swing it 52-48 for Brexit. The polls are entirely clear now that there is a wide measure of regret. That doesn't mean there's a majority for rejoining, but there is a clear measure. I mean, If you ask people, is Brexit going well, 80% say no. If you ask them, is it more of a success or more of a failure? Over 60% say more of a failure. Only 9% say more of a success. But the question then is, where do you go from here? And here I come to the UK's role. We are, in fact, diverging, right? The UK and the EU. If we do nothing at all, by the force des choses, because the EU continues to evolve and Britain isn't standing still, we are actually diverging. So it needs a major conscious effort to turn divergence into convergence. What you're going to see under the new Labour government is, which is 90% probability, I would say, 85, a big attempt to strike a new deal with the EU around movement of people, about professional exchanges, about financial services, an attempt to have a customized deal on single market, probably for manufactured goods, and customs union. Ironically enough, this actually looks pretty like soft Brexit, right? In a way.
Yes.
Since the EU is now going to be into customized deals, because that will bring me to Ukraine, let's see. It's not going to be an easy negotiation, but I think we can get there. And then the question becomes, at the end of the decade, is there a feeling that this is still not enough and we need to go further? And by the way, this will also involve a deal on foreign and security policy, which is clearly very important in relation to Ukraine and what follows Ukraine. So that very briefly on that point. On progressive integration, Paolo, so precisely because the candidate countries are not going to be net contributor countries, and you've lost a big net contributor in Britain. I mean, that's a significant economic fact. This progressive integration cannot be about devoting large sums from EU funds. So that I think what you do is you try and, so let's take Ukraine, for example. You have a series of steps which go, you do that, you get this. You do that step of reform, you get some infrastructure, you get some telecommunications, you get some digital, you get part of the energy union, and then gradual integration into the single market step by step, but always in return for more steps of reform and the reconstruction, which we're partly paying for anyway, so that what you're giving is more market access than funds. And the hope is that actually, you know, it's a big country with a lot of potential growth, with very significant resources. If you get investment, if you get growth, then you're actually growing the size of the cake. And you leave the really difficult questions, like institutions, full institutional membership, and, dare I say, taking CAP funds from French farmers to give them to Ukrainian farmers, not an easy thing to do, until the very end. And that can be years down the road. But in the meantime, the Ukrainians and the Georgians and people in the Western Balkans have the feeling, you know, they're getting somewhere, they're getting somewhere. Finally, and very quickly, on the West, China, India, which for me is really the big geopolitical question. We all knew that in this period after 1989, we were in a way moving into something that might be called a post-Western world, by which I don't mean a world where the West ceases to exist, because the West will continue to exist and be very rich and very powerful, but where the West is no longer able to set the agenda of world politics, right? Because there are these major non-Western great and middle powers who are increasingly rich and powerful, above all China, but by no means only, okay? So the question is, how do we relate to them? And I think we need a paradigm shift. At the moment, we're still in a bipolar paradigm when we say, here's this thing, the global South. How do we win over the global South to the West and the North, to the right side of history rather than the wrong side of history, away from Russia towards us? That's quite the wrong way to think about it. That's That's something that they very much resent with their own post-colonial history and imagination. The way to think about it is, here is India, here is Turkey, great powers with their own great civilizational history, now significant players in the world economy and in world politics. How do we as Europe relate to them? Let's have a conversation based in the first place on interests. You have your interests, we have our interests. In significant areas, they will actually coincide. Maybe we can get somewhere on that basis. And I think that's the way in which we will get much further in relations with countries like India, which, by the way, is an absolutely crucial swing state, but also probably Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, than in this bipolar framing, West, West, North and Global South, or Joe Biden's democracy autocracy.
Okay. Thank you very much. Perfect as usual. Now we have some more questions. Orlando Monteiro Silva, that is also involved on this matters of Europe and the questions like that. Orlando, please.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Professor Cartonash. My question is about something you mentioned. So we had the period after 91 with the, if I remember well, the Confederation of Independent States, and later, of course, with the Russian Federation, that tasted to some like it hadn't gone to the ultimate consequences of the Soviet Union's empire demise. So, in your opinion, are we assisting to let's say resurgence attempt of the empire, or a process of dismantling, kind of 2.0, or both? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have with us Francisco. I think Francisco is in Brussels now. Francisco, do you want to make a question? He's working in the European Commission, in the cabinet of our commissioner in Brussels. So he has a very good point of view of Europe. Francisco, please.
Thank you. I have a question. I have a couple of questions. Thank you. I'm here, of course, on a personal capacity, as I'm required to say at this state. I'm expert at the cabinet of Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, who's in charge of regional policy. But my questions are about you already partially answered my first question, which was about the EU. You mentioned that you will need to change to adjust to a much larger. It's not about being larger; it's about absorbing much poorer countries than the ones that we have, with less consolidated democracies. And we have the experience about some less consolidated democracies that entered the European Union. What do you think the European Union needs to change? You said how we need to approach the enlargement, but how do you see the internal arrangements how they will need to be adjusted? The second is about Russia. I'm not in the camp that dismisses Putin, and you were very, very clear. You said that Putin comes out of this crisis very much weakened, probably not with the public opinion, but certainly in the political and military circles. But I would not dismiss him as yet. But if he goes, what you see Russia could be next would be what would be the Russia after Putin, and what do you think? Whether you think this could happen in the short term? Thank you.
Okay, and now I think we have here with us Mario Franco. He also very expert on international relations and things like that. Mario, do you want to make a question to Professor, please?
Hello, thank you. Yes, I would like thank you, Professor, for the very interesting presentation. Sorry, and I have not yet read the book, but I have three questions based on the intervention. And the first one is exactly linked to the last question. It is, if Russia lose their face and in some way imploded, what will be the consequence, in your opinion, special in two aspects? First, the nuclear power, nuclear arms, and the second, which will be the role of Russia in Europe? What will be the relation with the rest of Europe? The second question is, in the new enlarged Europe, in your opinion, which will be the role of the United States? Shall United States play the same type of role with a bigger power, and special if we have European defense, strategic defense without United States? Or in your opinion, even in large, Europe will be completely always dependent on the United States and the same kind of relation? Last point, which I would like to have your opinion, and this is a very short one, is I think the logic of concentrated all the European discussion on the East is one point, but in your opinion, what will be Europe role in the south of Europe, especially in the Mediterranean region, where you have new powers, new relations? We see the Saudi-Iran new agreement, the role of Turkey, and many other actors. What will be their role in this new Europe and in this new situation, in your opinion, of course, with Russia? Thank you. Sorry, it was very large, but
Okay,
your intervention was very good.
You have already here lots of thought for discussing.
Thank you for these very modest and simple questions. If you give me one moment, I'm just going to open the window here because it's boiling hot in Estoril, and
yes,
absolutely.
We are in summer already.
There we are. There
Okay.
we are. Not a matter of hot air, but just the actual external temperature. Okay, fantastic set of questions. Let me pick and choose a bit, starting with how the EU should change. Could I answer you in terms of method, rather than of precise detail?
Okay.
This is to Francisco. So I think it is a mistake immediately to get stuck on a specific institutional issue like qualified majority voting, right? I mean, obviously, the fact that Viktor Orban can hold the EU to ransom on every single vote on sanctions is a huge problem. And it would have been much better if we had had qualified majority voting before this. But as you know better than me, the way the EU works, something may not work in theory, but it works in practice, right? And so what I would like to see is a really intensive conversation in Brussels, in the institutions, in the think tanks, in universities, in national governments too, saying our objects are to make the EU more efficient, more effective, but also to enable it to enlarge. How do we go about that? Do you see what I mean? In other words, I think we need a really creative discussion, recognizing how difficult it is, rather than just immediately focusing on the immediate institutional solution that is to hand, and to recognize that this may have elements of differential integration. That's what progressive integration is. On the South, very quickly, just to jump to that one, I mean, again, a huge issue, but, I have a chapter in my book based on a visit to Ceuta, of course, the oldest European colony in Africa, originally a Portuguese colony, now Spanish. And what you have there at the frontier is a new Iron Curtain, a more than 6-meter high fence, barbed wire, raked sand, another fence, infrared, armed guards. I can tell you, because I've seen them both, it looks exactly like the old Iron Curtain. And that illustrates the problem, which is that we're going to have an order of magnitude of larger challenges in terms of mass migration and instability coming from the South. And so all I can say on that, and it's very inadequate, is that if East European countries are going to argue the importance of eastward enlargement and ask you in the very west of Europe to support it, then they, for their part, have to take the challenges from the South equally seriously. And that is not happening at the moment. So it has to be both. It's a quid pro quo. Now, this brings me to Russia and then to the US. With benefit of hindsight, we can see that one of the greatest single drivers of European history over the last 40 years has been the decline of the Russian Empire, which became evident already from the early 1980s. And it's this extraordinary moment in 1991. I mean, in normal historical development, that would have been a much longer, more discontinuous and difficult process. But this extraordinary conjuncture in 1991, where the central colonial power, Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, is the one that delivers the death blow to the empire, right? That doesn't often happen. It's not often the imperial center that delivers the death blow. So in a sense, the process ran far ahead of itself. And now, as you rightly say, it's both the empire in decline and the empire trying to strike back. That process is going to be with us, preoccupying us, worrying us for decades to come. We're going to be wrestling with the decline of the Russian Empire and its consequences for decades to come. I agree that, I mean, nobody knows, but it's likely that Putin will stay in power for some time to come. And my view is that we have to recognize that our capacity for directly influencing domestic developments inside Russia is very limited, right? So it's a classic fallacy of Western policy to think that we can influence domestic developments in other countries, particularly dictatorships, much more than we can. But particularly a personalist autocracy in an extreme state of repression and denial with which we have very few ties, we have very little capacity to influence it directly. What we can do is to influence the geopolitical environment around it by working towards the double eastward enlargement, right? So that ensuring that Putin does not succeed in his project of restoring the Russian Empire, and then be ready to respond to whatever happens. Nobody knows. Listen, not even the, somebody says it'll be worse, somebody says it'll be better. None of them know. Not even the actors in Moscow themselves know what it's going to be. We have to be ready to respond to the various contingencies. But at the same time, and this is a very important point, communicating directly to the Russian people that another future is possible, that there is a different relationship possible with Russia, and that Europe would like that relationship. Finally, and quickly on the US and the security relationship, we need to make a stronger Europe also in security and defense, not only in our own interests, but also precisely to keep the United States in, right? So I do not believe in strategic autonomy in the Gaullist sense, in which Macron sometimes talks about it. We cannot be a vassal of the United States. We must be a third pole, as he said in his interview coming back from China. I think that is a mistake. But what I do think we need is l'Europe puissance, more European power, build up our own security, defense, and foreign policy capacity, first of all, to defend our own interests and values against an aggressive Russia, but also against China and other outside powers. But also because that is actually the best way to keep the United States in. If, for example, a Republican administration, let's hope it's not Donald Trump, has the sense that Europe is actually doing more for its own defense, in the best case, if Ukraine wins, you have the largest and most combat-hardened army in Europe in Ukraine, and Germany is spending 2% of GDP on defense, and a large army in Poland. So we're doing more for our own defense. What that means potentially, best case for the US, is that they can actually do what they've been trying to do for the last 25 years and devote more resources to the Indo-Pacific, right, for their great challenge, which is, of course, China and the danger of war or conflict over Taiwan. So I think there is a win-win that comes not in a Euro-goalist strategy of building up Europe as an alternative to the United States, but building up European power and security and defense policy, but in a strategic partnership with the United States. And I hope that Portugal, as a classic Euro-Atlantic power, I'm looking out to the Atlantic here, might agree.
Perfect, Timothy. So we are close. Okay, we have 10 minutes to have our 1 hour combined. We have here with us Felipe Coutinho, that is also involved in international relations and is also an expert on some matters economics. Do you want to make a comment, Felipe, please? Felipe, are you listening?
Yeah, I am. I'm just putting up.
Okay.
Hello, John. Well, thank you for the amazing presentation. Brilliant, as we were expecting. I would like to ask, given the growing influence of technology and digital transformation, how do you think Europe can leverage these advancements to its advantage and ensure a fair and inclusive digital future for all its citizens?
Okay, perfect. Very good, Philippe. Thank you. We have also Besma, that is also involved in international relations. Besma is from Tunisian, but okay, is also here living in Portugal. Besma, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. It's been
We are not seeing
very...
you. We are not seeing you.
Yeah. I'm in the car, so it's
okay,
no
okay,
problem.
Okay.
So I'll just ask a very quick question. I wanted to focus on the relationship north-south in this case. And I, being originally from Africa, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the relationship of Europe and Africa. Africa having, a huge untapped potential. 6 of the largest of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. The youth segment, you name it, like the renewable energy, there's so many factors. But what I personally see is I see a lot of unilateral European countries unilaterally going and trying to do something in Africa. While if you travel around in Africa, you'll see the effect of China. You see them in all mega projects, even Russia in some places, although more towards defense. Was wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of what Europe is and can be doing in order to tap some of that potential of Africa? Thank you very much.
Perfect, Pesma. And we are going to finish like we started with Paul San. Paulo wants to make a final question, and with that we close. Please, Paulo.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, but being the
no problem. Please, no problem.
Having been the first, well, you evoked so many issues that I have at least one thing. I don't want to complicate, but there's one question I have to put. It concerns populism and democracy, because in fact, well, Philippe already addressed the issue of changes in terms of technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. But my question is, isn't there also an issue concerning democracy? Isn't democracy getting weaker in Europe? And doesn't it? How can it evolve in order to address all the issues that you put today, and all these big challenges? And once again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, so Professor, now,
well, if I may say so, you're giving me a terrific intellectual workout. In the space of 40 minutes, you've asked all the important questions, or almost all of them. Look, technology, digital, just a couple of quick comments. One is, obviously we need smarter regulation, but there's a very unfortunate de facto division of labor very recently in the transatlantic conversation, which is the US does all the innovation, Europe does all the regulation. And that's a very unhealthy state of affairs.
Totally agree.
Now, we're just beginning to see the beginnings of a really significant conversation around regulation in the US Congress and in the Biden administration. They're starting to do some significant things on regulation, How about we did something on innovation, right? How about we thought really creatively about how, with all our fantastic diversity and national interests, we couldn't use that diversity. Obviously, there's a huge problem of scale, network effects plus monopoly, because it's both in the case of a Facebook or a Google, right? But even faced with that challenge, you know, there's another phase of the digital revolution coming our way. Can't we do some spectacular piece of innovation there? That's point number one. Point number two connects to the point about populism and democracy. Look, I don't know if AI is a threat to the future of human existence on the planet, I must admit, but perhaps because I'm no longer young, that stuff doesn't worry me so much. But what sure as hell worries me is the already demonstrated possibilities of deep fakes, of manipulation on a massive scale, really effectively, right? We think that's Macron on the video, but it's not Macron, but millions of people believe it. So I do think, you know, something where we have to move very, very fast is in that particular area where digital technological, especially AI development, is going to directly impact the integrity of democracy and the integrity of the electoral process. I think we have to move fast on that one. On North-South, I mean, a huge challenge. The tragedy of the however many hundred migrants it was who were recently sunk, right, despite the fact that a Greek Coast Guard ship was evidently nearby, just brings that home to us once again. I have only two inadequate thoughts on that, Besma. One is, obviously, we have to provide more safe, legal channels of immigration carefully managed. Point number two, nobody talks about development anymore. Development is almost nowhere in the European conversation. But that is the great missing piece. How can we use that potential that you were talking about, catalyze it, encourage it, to make, you know, real life chances for more young people in Africa, so that they don't feel they have to risk their lives in flimsy boats across the Mediterranean, you know, or at the fence at Ceuta, because otherwise we will have not hundreds, but tens of thousands of people saying, as one of the migrants did, Europe or death. So I think a new focus on development policy. My colleague Paul Collier at Oxford, by the way, a wonderful development economist, has done some, you might like to have him on the program, he's done some terrific work on precisely this, about how you do it, as well as devoting resources. Finally, Paolo, to come back to the future of democracy, let me make one concluding point. One of the great arguments of my book is that the Europe we have today, which is the best Europe we've ever had, with all its faults, is the work of 4 key generations, each of whom was shaped by formative experiences in their youth. The 14ers, those who were shaped by the experience of the First World War, the 39ers, shaped by the Second World War, the 68ers,
Interesting,
and the 89ers, those shaped by their youthful experience of the great year of wonders, 1989, the end of the Cold War. And the question, and by the way, there's a question that was put to me by a student at the University of Göttingen, is there going to be a generation of 22ers? Is there going to be a generation of young Europeans who say, hey, we're back with the largest war in Europe since 1945. Everything we worked to prevent for the last 80 years is now happening again. We really have to mobilize to take Europe forward rather than letting it fall backwards. Now, at the moment, I have to say, and also if you look at the public opinion polls, there's not a great deal of evidence of that. I mean, they're definitely there in Ukraine. I've met them, amazing young generation in Ukraine. They're there in other, Estonia, Poland, other East European countries. But the further west you come to Britain or Portugal or Spain, it's not so self-evident. But you know what? The 68ers weren't born. That generation was made. It was made by a generation of young political leaders who put together a set of issues to take forward the change. And I think what I would love to see is a new generation engaging in politics which connects the issues of freedom and security that come from the East, and to some extent from the South, with the great issues for this generation, namely climate change and inequality. And so, you know, I think that's what we should hope to see, and that's what we should try to encourage, is a new generation of the 22ers, so that when I write the sequel to this book, it can have a more optimistic conclusion.
Professor Timothy, it was a pleasure to have you here with us. Everyone is going to buy the book and to read the book, and I hope we can in the future have another meeting. So have a nice stay in Portugal. I hope you have the good sun that you are having in the studio, and I hope we'll meet after tomorrow. Okay. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Thank
Have
you.
a nice day.
Thank you.
And
Bye.
Okay. Have a nice day. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.